think that's a good place to start because we'll introduce our partners on this. So we're excited that this time actually Yonatan Rahmani is representing the Habura, which for those who don't know, it's an online and global Beit Midrash with international students striving to know God by embracing the world through the lens of Torah. You can, and like we just heard, you can sign in from anywhere. They encourage bigger and broader participants, and it's really focused on the Sephardi philosophy and the Sephardi approach to halakha. And it's based out of London. So it's an interesting organization and something to be a part of and to learn from. In addition, we welcome you on behalf of the American Sephardic Federation Institute of Jewish Experience and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier International Program of Yeshiva University. We welcome everybody today to a little bit of rabbinics, and hopefully we're going to get a little bit away from history. We've been pretty history heavy lately, and a little bit into the rabbinics. So again, your microphones and cameras are off until the end. I invite you to open them at the end. Enjoy. I'll hand it over to Professor Perlis. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. If you're those of us here on the East Coast, and good evening to those further east. It's a real pleasure today to start this series. This is part of a three-part series of partnership with the Habura. The Habura is really a fascinating, exciting new group doing really wonderful things, both globally and very locally. I see that they do a lot of in-person events as well now, thank God, as things are getting better. And I was very excited to be able to partner with ASF and Institute for Jewish Experience on this project and being able to give a platform to this group. And I want to, without any further ado, I want to introduce our guest today, Yonatan Rahmani, who's a Jewish educator based in New York City, serves as the inaugural Rabbinic Fellow for SAMi, Sephardic American Mizrahi Initiative. He hopes to act as a connector for those who are seeking meaning in their lives and to draw Am Yisrael closer to Torah, ultimately bringing them closer to Hashem. Today's talk on Hakham Faur, I'm very excited for this. And those of you who know about Hakham Faur, I'm sure will learn something new. And those of you who don't know who he was, will certainly have their horizons expanded. So thank you very much, Yonatan, and take it away.
Thank you, Professor Perlis. I'm going to share my screen and just please confirm that you can see it. Okay,
yep, we see it perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, so today I have the distinct privilege to teach a bit about Hakham Faur. Hakham Faur, as many of you know, he was a rabbi from Argentina, and then he came to, he came to Brooklyn. I studied in Lakewood. We'll go through a little bit biography of him. He unfortunately passed away last year, a little bit more than a year and a half ago, maybe around a year and a half ago. And I came to his works much later. I only started reading his works about maybe 3 years ago. I was taking a lecture series with a dear friend of mine, Angie, and she's a professor of Sephardic history. And she was telling me about, there's this Hakham, he lives in Netanya, and I just showed up, I found his works, and I was just so enamored by his works. So I reached out to him, and he invited me to come spend the day with him and his wife, and we learned, and who was this Hakham? And Hakham Faur. And that was the first time I learned of Hakham Faur, and since then I have just, anytime I've had a question, I've asked many questions to his son, thank God, Hakham Abe, who lives in Brooklyn. And I only get like a snippet. I watch as much as I can of teachings of his father. I try and read as much as I can from his students. And as you'll see, I feel like I'm learning so much about my past through him because I wasn't given the opportunity to learn in the tradition of my forefathers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm going to move forward. The way we're going to do today's lecture is I have, so his work, I have it printed out here. It's, I don't know, 11 pages or so, 12 pages. It's called Hora'at HaTalmud B'Masoret HaChinuchit HaSepharadit. And this is essentially the teaching of the Gemara, the Talmud, in the Sephardic educational tradition, in the Masorah of the Sephardim. I believe it was written in the 70s. He wrote over 100 essays. I think 9 books were published. I want to also mention Yafeh Be'ito, which is a new, foundation that was established by his son and many of his students. And they are sharing a lot of his lectures. They have just hundreds of recordings of him giving talks. And they have many of his articles that are being republished, and his books are being republished. And I highly recommend Google Yafeh Be'ito, or go to their website, and you can see, I think every week they're going to be posting a new shiur. So I'll just give a brief bio. We'll go pretty quickly over this to move into the content. Hakham Faur was known, he was born in Buenos Aires. In 17, he went to Mexico City, and thereafter he went to Lakewood. This is a very important point to dwell on, because in Lakewood is where he became acquainted with the Ashkenazi approach to learning Gemara. He studied under the very famous Rabbi Aaron Kotler, and then he went to Harvard University. Professor Harry Wolfson, who many of those listening to this call may have read some of his works, he pushed him to go to Spain. I believe in Spain, he was one of the first, him and another student were the two of the first Jewish students to return to Spain to get a PhD there. He studied in Barcelona. And then when he came back to America, he ended up in, he came to, I guess he ended up in Brooklyn. He studied under Hakham Abadi, and he got much higher level Dayanut in Semicha, which is rabbinic ordination. And he went to JTS, and he studied with, he worked alongside Professor Saul Lieberman, famous professor who put together the Tosefta Kipshuta. He left JTS and went to Eretz Yisrael. And when he was in Eretz Yisrael, he taught in Bar Ilan. He wrote many, many works, Horizontal Society and Homo Mysticus. Homo Mysticus is on the Moreh Nevuchim by Harambam. And Horizontal Society is an incredible 2-part work that goes through and explains many parts of Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism, that unfortunately is just not, it's not the way Judaism is taught about today. It's not how it's talked about. It's not how it's lived. And Horizontal Society, which I cannot put it into one sentence, but each of us, whether King of Yisrael, the Kohen Gadol of Yisrael, or a simple member of the community, a shepherd in the land, we all follow the same code of law. We're all on one horizontal level. Nobody is above anybody. The law it puts us all in the same place. We get the law from the same source. I highly recommend everybody go out, search Hakham Faur, read his works, find a teacher. His son, Abe Faur, Hakham Abe, has many, many videos online. And with that, we'll continue. So this right here is a famous quote. I first read it in this book, Sephardim in 20th Century America. Wonderful book that goes through the history of the Sephardim in America. And I believe this is also on the Wikipedia page. And I just want to read this first before we enter into the text. My years in Lakewood were pleasurable and profitable. At the same time, the lessons of Rabbi Kotler and my contacts with fellow students were making me aware of some basic methodological flaws in their approach. The desire to shortcut their way into the Talmud without a systematic methodological knowledge of basic Jewish texts made their analysis skimpy and haphazard. The dialectics that were being applied to the study of Talmud, this is the pilpul that is famously done in the Litvak and the Eastern European yeshivot, they were not only making shambles out of the text, but what was more disturbing to me, they were also depriving the very concept of Jewish law, halakha, of all meaning. We'll dwell on this a bit more later on. Since everything could be proven and disproven, there were no absolute categories of right and wrong. Accordingly, the only possibility of morality is for the faithful to surrender himself to an assigned superior authority. It is the faithful's duty to obey this authority, simply because it is the authority and because he is faithful. More precisely, devotion is not to be measured by an objective halakha, which has been destroyed by the dialectics, but by obedience. Within the system of morality, there was no uniform duty. It was the privilege of the authority to make special dispensations and allowances. We talk about these as hetarim to some of the faithful. Conversely, the authority can impose some new obligation and duties on all or a part of the faithful. Now, just reading this last part, we see this is a vertical society. We have one person dictating what the law should be, which is very much goes against the idea of the horizontal society. Okay, and so here we see the other approach. And I want to start off by saying the other approach because this is the dominant approach in the world of yeshivot today. It just is. There are I believe Kisera Hamim has a different approach in Bnei Brak under Rav Mazuz. But outside of Kisera Hamim, it is very much the Ashkenazi approach. It has, quote unquote, won. It has overtaken all the other systems of learning. So I want to start with that because my question today, that I hope each of us asks by the end of it, we have many questions, is what can we do about it? Is there another approach? Is there another approach that we can apply for the upcoming generation? Can we apply it to current students? Can we apply it to ourselves? And can we also apply it to adults? All right, so with that, we'll move forward. Now, I have both the Hebrew here, and then we also have the English translation. So we'll use a mixture of the English and the Hebrew, but just for time's sake, I want to move forward. And so we will utilize a bit more of the English today. And I would like to also just think, I believe this English translation was put together by Michael Shak. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name properly, but one of the other things that the Habura is doing is trying to translate many Hebrew texts, many Hebrew essays, many Hebrew books into English so that it can reach a wider audience. Okay, so there are 3 stages of learning. This is how Hakham Faur opens up his wonderful essay. Okay, we have Shlosha Shalavim Hem Beseder HaChinuch HaSepharadi. The Sepharadi approach is composed of 3 stages. Shelav Harishon Hu Hora'at HaMiqra. First, one must be very comfortable with the Miqra. They need to learn the Miqra. What is the Miqra? We'll get to that after. The second level is Halakha, and the third level is Talmud. And this only comes in the end, Hasofi. Okay, Seder Zeh, this order was put together by Hazal, and they directed us to divide our study schedule into 3 parts. We have Shalish B'Mikra, Shalish B'Mishnah, Shalish Talmud. And one of the reasons that this is that the Hakhamim, they warned us, do not, pardon me, do not be haphazard, do not rush through Mikra and Mishnah so that you can then get into the Gemara. And we'll see why that is important. Okay, so we've first established, first part, 3 stages of learning. This right here is now going to break down, in each stage has more stages, okay? So let's talk more about stage 1, Miqra. Why is Miqra so important? First, I'll just quote Rabbi Devorah Halevi. I was watching one of her shiurim with the Habura recently, and she said that you should always start with Tanakh. Whatever you're doing, start with Tanakh. Why? Because in Tanakh, you get the Jewish people. You get Am Yisrael. You get actually Bnei Yisrael, not the Jewish people. You get the full line of our heart, of who we are, of the not just the stories of who we are, you get the laws are given. And from there, you have the foundation that everything else is based on. I'll put it this way. A person needs to first learn the Constitution of the United States of America before they start looking at any of the current laws that have been, any of the laws that have been legislated in the past 100 years. None of that will matter if we have a debate on the Second Amendment, gun control in America, which is a very hot topic. None of that will matter if you have never read the Second Amendment in its source. All right, so we have here the first stage is the foundation of the Jewish education. Without this, we have no values that unify all of us. Someone once said to me, the beautiful thing about the Jewish world is anywhere you go to a Beit Knesset on Shabbat, and you're within one or two parshiot of each other, whether you're in Israel or in America. And for a long time, that was true. That's unfortunately changed in recent years for different concerns. But a person can go to any Beit Knesset and you hear the same parasha, you have the same Torah, you have the same, the Nevi'im and Ketuvim. It's the same for everybody. Okay, we have an interesting halakha. There's an obligation on every father to teach his son the Miqra. Lo Mishnah ulo Talmud. Yesh omrim, there are some who say, Miqra hu Torah bilvad. That when we talk about Miqra, we only mean the 5 books of Moshe, the Chumash. Yesh omrim, mehem Harambam. There are those others who say, and among this is Harambam, Maimonides, distinguished rabbi from about 800 or so years ago. He wrote the Yad Hazakah, the greatest index of all laws that we have, both applicable today and applicable with the temple. That's known as the Mishnah Torah. He says that the Miqra, v'chayav lelamdot b'schar ad sheikra Torah shebichtav kulaha. That the obligation on a father is actually that he needs to teach the son the entire the entire written scripture, which means the Bible, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the Tanakh, what we call today the Tanakh. So this is going to include all 24 books. And he also says here that you can pay for it. If you can't do it yourself, you have to pay someone to do it. Which means step one is that every father is obligated to teach his son. Let's set this out. Every father is obligated to teach his son the entire Tanakh. And if he can't teach his son the entire Tanakh, he has to pay for it. Okay, so we'll set that. That's one. נוסף למקרא, יעמדו בשלב זה, גם את סידור התפילה, כולו, עם הדינים והמנהגים הקשורים בו. So on top of the Miqra, and this right here, I think is just so beautiful. I was speaking with a teacher of mine about this, that on top of the Miqra, he needs to teach the entire Siddur, the entire prayer service. It was taught alongside it, along with its different laws and customs applicable. So when I read this, I quickly thought of what would the Jewish world be like today if every Jew knew the entire Tanakh and the Siddur properly. Let's just put it out there. Siddurim did not exist about 500 years ago. Until the printing press came along, the average Jew did not have a printed text of the Siddur. They had to know it up here, or they would go to the Beit Knesset and they would listen to the Shaliach Tzibor recite it for them. So the idea of teaching the Siddur makes complete sense. Furthermore, the Siddur is made up, quite a bit of the Siddur is made up of verses from the Tanakh. So we say today, like Pesukei de Zimra. Pesukei de Zimra is it's all verses from Tehillim. And we have Vayvarech David, another part from Nevi'im. We have throughout, you open up a Siddur, and I once heard someone say this, that for a long time, he only really cared about the brachot. Then he realized, what am I doing skipping over the verses, the Pesukim? The Pesukim were Ko Amar Hashem. They were from the mouth of Hashem, so to speak. The prophet gave over those with the Ruach HaKodesh as they were prophets. And so it completely changed. How do I approach Pesukim? Pesukim are not just words to say. There are words that have specific meanings and context. And all this was obligated on the father to teach his son. We'll move further along. And again, I apologize. I'm going to have to move a little quick, so I will be skipping a bit. And the full article can be found online. I can provide that after. And there is also an English translation I believe we can provide as well for those who have more questions. So stage one is Torah, Miqra, which includes, according to Harambam, all of Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, alongside the Siddur. Okay, Mishnah, which is the second level, we're not talking about Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda, the prince who put together the Mishnah that we have from Tiberius. Rather, this means halacha. So Rav Saadia Gaon, he translated Mishnah in Arabi as fiqh. And this is to say halakha pesukah. This is what we say is the final law, the apodictic law, which means that you have your ta'aseh, your do's and your don'ts. An example of this is don't kill. That's that right there. That's pesaq. Just don't kill. Within that, there are certain situations where you might have to kill. That's the pesaq. Okay, this is the understanding by Harambam. All right, there are many different halakhic works that were written by the Geonim. I'll continue. I'll just mention one of them. The halachot of Rav Yitzhak Alafasi, the Rif. The Rif was very important because he went through the entire Gemara, and he essentially got rid of anything that wasn't the pesach halakha. And from there, that was the beginning of us having, that led to the Mishneh Torah. And again, there are much greater scholars, I'm barely a scholar, that have written much about this. I highly suggest take a look up Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi and see how that fits into the history that led to the Mishneh Torah and then the Shulchan Aruch by Maran Yosef Karo. Okay, we'll continue now. So we have stage one. We've said what is stage one? Is Miqra, which includes Tanakh and the Siddur. Stage two, Mishnah, which is really halakha, which means that you need to know all of the halakha. I feel like I skipped over that very quickly. You need to know all of the halakha, and this was done at separate times by what they have. Today, it would make sense you need to learn all of Shulchan Aruch, all of Mishneh Torah, and all of the halachot of the Rif. And from there, once a person has graduated from learning all of Tanakh, all of the Siddur, then all of the halakha. And then once you finish that, okay, now you're ready for Gemara. There was no Daf Yomi in the Beit Knesset for the Am. This didn't exist. There was no, nobody was going through and talking about a sugya unless you weren't even, I've talked to my father about this, who comes from Iran. And I asked my dad, what did you learn in the Beit Knesset? He said, well, we went and we listened to the rabbi teach, and a lot of times they did Chok Yisrael. Chok Yisrael is a beautiful work that was put together by students of the Arizal, big Kabbalists from Safat, and then updated by the Hida. It has a little bit of Torah, a little bit of Nevi'im, a little bit of Ketuvim, the Rashi on each of those in the Targum. Then it has a little bit of Mishnah, a little bit, a small portion of Gemara that was almost always not the halachic sugiot. It was almost always Agadah. And then after that, a little bit of halacha, a little bit of Zohar, a little bit of Musar. And I asked, so what do you mean? Like, you just went to the Beit Knesset, you prayed, and you learned whatever the rabbi was teaching from the Chok? He said, yeah, we never learned Gemara. He said, I 100% could tell you we were never learning Gemara. Now I go to my father's Beit Knesset here in Brooklyn. May they live and be well for a long time. The rabbi's there. It's all Gemara. All Gemara. Oldest to youngest, everybody's learning Gemara. Most times when I go, I sit there with a Chumash and I practice the Miqra for the week because I'm still myself building up to Gemara. All right, so now we are in the third stage, Talmud. This is the final stage. This comes after you've done everything else. It also includes the legal and the religious modes of thought of the sages. And this is the very, very important part. It was very, very rare to get to the stage, okay? Only individuals got to the stage. You did not have, if you had 100 students, maybe 1, 2, 3 got to the stage. I think that's very important. We will have to hold that as we keep going forward. We have, Hakham Faur brings this beautiful, he tells us what each person is called at each level. Excuse me. So a graduate of the first level, a person who knows all of the Miqra and the Siddur, it's an Am Haaretz. Today, an Am Haaretz is known as, a person doesn't know anything. I think in the yeshivish world, they say, no, Am Haaretz is someone who can't read a Tosafot. Okay, we'll hold that. A person who graduates from the second level, we call that person a Talmidei Hakhamim. This is a person who's a student of the sages. And only the person who completes the final stage is known as a Hakhamim. We call those people Hakhamim. So now let's think to ourselves, how many Hakhamim are really out there? How many of our teachers know the entire Miqra? Know all of the halakha? You can ask them a question from any part of the halakha, and they can answer you. It's very few. Today, it's like extremely few. I'll leave it at that. So this right here, we started off with the approach in Bet Midrash Gavoa in Lakewood. This is the approach of the French and German rabbis. So Seder Limud ze lo haya mekubal etzal Rabbanei Tzarafat Ashkenaz. This process was not the same process that the rabbis of France and Germany had. They had a completely different approach. All right, so let's look at what Rabbeinu Tam said. He says, for us, we're engaged in the study of the Bavli. That's enough. It's sufficient. That's enough. We don't need anything else. Why? Within the Bavli, we have both Miqra, Mishnah, and Talmud. Right? So I've heard many yeshivish rabbis say, what are you doing bringing me a pasuk? We don't talk about pasukim. We look at the gemara. Zeh, that's it. If you open up a daf of gemara, you'll see there's pasukim mixed in. It's talking about a Mishnah up top. And so they figure we learn it from the page. There's a joke of a young yeshivish student is sitting and is reading the Haftarah of the week, and he says, "Oh my God, I came across a pasuk. This pasuk comes from the Gemara." So it goes to show doesn't know the pasuk comes from the Navi. Okay, so Rashi, Shlomo Yishaki, he interpreted this warning of the sages that I mentioned earlier, which is do not, or it's a different warning. Sorry, restrain your children from logic, as meaning do not overly accustom them to studying scripture because it allures. It causes them to go after other things. I will say, just from a historical perspective, someone explained this to me once, is that we're talking about in France and Germany, they were under the Christian, the Christian monarchy, the Christian empires. They were surrounded by Christians. There are no French or German works written in Latin, as opposed to you go into the Arab world and the Spanish world, and we have actually every single work of Harambam, apart from Mishneh Torah, was written in Judeo-Arabic. That was not happening in France and Germany. I think a lot of it, I believe it was illegal for them to write in Latin. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But they didn't want to write in the language of the church. And so they only ever wrote in Hebrew. But they also were surrounded by clergy that they studied Miqra. And so to completely distinguish themselves from the Christians, they did not study the Miqra. This was explained to me by a few different people. I don't know how historically true that is, but it does make quite a bit of sense. And then we know with the Perush Harashi on Tanakh is filled with midrashim, and so there's this idea that we see as Hakham Faur says here, that it seems that he intended to say that when you're learning scripture, it's not that you should keep them from studying scripture. Rather, you should have them study scripture through the lens of the Parshanut of Chazal, of the exegesis of the sages. The way the sages understood the Pesukim is how you understood the Pesukim, which is not how it continued. This, again, is another fascinating part that Hakham Faur brings. That the Hakhamim of Sarfat, of France, they were not even aware, the Yadua, of the way of the learning that was taught in Spain and in the Mizrach. One of the main criticisms, I got into an argument with one of my teachers very recently, all the time really, about this, is that you talk to most Ashkenazim and the predominant approach is that Harambam wrote the Mishneh Torah to get rid of the Gemara. And this is how the Ashkenazim saw it, is that by learning all of the halakha, you diminish the Gemara. All right, so Harambam, he pushes back on this and he clarifies in his, actually what they quote push against is in his Hakdama, that he wrote the Mishnah Torah lefichach, therefore, karati sham hibor ze Mishnah Torah. This is why I've called the name of this composition Mishnah Torah. Lefisha adam koreh b'Torah shebichtav tehillah. Once a person knows all of the Torah shebichtav first, so we've already established this. This right here, Shadav Hadishon, this is added by Hakham Faur. This right here is the first step. The Hardkach, Hashadav Hasheni, meaning, and after that, you then learn the halacha, Torah shebe'al peh kulaha. When he says this, he's not talking about gemara, he is talking about the halacha. So again, this right here, very important difference between the approach of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And we see that even in Spain, those who they hit a very high level of study, they continue to learn. They continue to see that the Miqra was the ikar. It was the foundation. It was the essence of everything. Rav Yosef ibn Migash, he writes that the Talmud, hu bi'or ha-Torah perushah. This is the elucidation and meaning of the Torah. Lo amitasha Torah. This is not the Torah itself. The Talmud is, we understand the Torah better because of the Talmud. It does not replace the Torah itself. Observe how, unlike the actual Torah, the Talmud does not require trace lines. So if you open up if you open up any Torah, there's trace lines necessary. Same with Megillah. You'll see it has trace lines in it. This is not required for the Talmud. The Talmud, you can write it on anything, and we know it's printed on paper today. It is therefore apparent that its sanctity does not reach that of the Torah itself. Does not even reach the sanctity of the rest of the Tanakh, since we observe that in addition, it does not defile the hands. And this is the defiling of the hands was a rabbinic enactment that it showed the level of kedusha. We'll skip that because we want to move forward. We're already down to the last 10 minutes. And you're not even allowed to put it on top of any of the works, definitely not on top of any of the prophetic works, and definitely not on top of the Torah. Right? So we'll skip this. Essentially, this was maintained until recent times. This approach to learning in the Sephardi world was maintained to different times. Hakham Faur then says that if you went into a Beit Knesset, a person who was learning Miqra did not go and learn halakha, and a person who was learning halakha did not go and learn gemara. You could only attend those classes once you were proficient. So now we're in part two. So we've established part one is you have 3 levels of learning, Miqra, halakha, and gemara. Part 2 is how what was considered Talmudic literature. Okay, so in the eyes of Geonim and the medieval Sephardic rabbis, the Talmud is not a literary genre containing a framework of values, which enable its understanding without connection to sources that are external to it. The entire point of the Talmudic literature was a chain of transmission. So this is why the direct chain of educational transmission regarding the proper understanding of the Gemara from the academies of the Amoraim to the Geonim, all the way to the rabbis of today is so essential. Without this tradition, the student of the Gemara will be incapable of orientating himself. And in Arabic, this is known as talqin. So talqin is essentially a face-to-face transmission. Rav Saadia Gaon, he writes, talqin is when a person learns the basics of forms of knowledge. After you have the basics of a person learns the basics of forms of knowledge and their tenets from someone else who preceded them. Case in point is that until recent times, there was no such thing as a person who went to law school. A person who wanted to learn law went and sat and they sat and studied law under another lawyer. They did not, there was no school that you went to learn law. You went and found a lawyer and you learned through them. Abraham Lincoln, for example, he did not go to law school to learn law. He learned law by finding a lawyer to teach him law. This continues in many artisanal endeavors. A person who wants to learn a certain craft has to find someone who is proficient. You cannot learn. I'm a amateur baker, and I sell sourdoughs. It's one of my hobbies, and one of the things maybe in another life I would have been a baker instead of an educator. To learn how to make artisanal bread required me learning it from my brother. My brother learned it from someone else. You can only learn so much from a book, and that right there is a terrible example because you can learn quite a bit from a book. You can apply that to law because that has people's lives is literally in their hands, and the law needs to be transmitted in a way that goes all the way back to when the law was given. The teacher needs to know the direction that the student's heart inclines. That is to say, his predispositions and his value system. Meaning, you can't know what the student is feeling if they are in another room. You have to see in their eyes and see in their heart. So this is how Rav Sar Shalom, who was a Gaon, talks about it. I apologize, my throat is a little dry. And if God had willed that you be in our presence, it would have been possible to explain them very well and to clarify the difference between them very well, as is fitting for a matter spoken in different phrases. This is because when a student sits in front of his master and debates in halakha, his master can see how his heart inclines, what is hidden from it, what is clear to it, and about what it remains obstinate. Then he can enlighten his eyes and direct him in halakha. I think when I read this we talked today of our moods. Are we in the mood to learn? Now, when I'm in front of someone, they can clearly see how I'm feeling by my posture. Am I sitting attentively? Am I looking in their eyes? Am I responding? Or am I completely hitting me and going nowhere? A person who is face-to-face can very much see this. Much harder to do over Zoom, definitely harder to do through writing. There was a lot of sharp criticism against those who sought to understand Talmud based on their own personal judgment. This means without a teacher. And we'll look a little bit at Pilpul, and then we'll finish off with the Gemara. The early Sephardic rabbis, they did not see any relationship between Talmudic logic and halachic decision-making. We don't leave a clear Talmudic conclusion to rule based off of the give and take of the Talmud, the shakla b'tariyah. We have pesaq halacha, and that's the conclusion. It does not make sense for a person to abandon practical halacha in pursuit of difficulties in their resolutions. If you open up Tosafot is constantly quoting all over the Gemara. Something doesn't work here because it opposes something that is said here. And then we start analyzing the two things, not thinking about the context, not understanding maybe this is a specific law that we have here. And we start breaking down, well, if it says something here, then it must mean that same thing elsewhere. And we start breaking down the halakha. In the eyes of the Tosafos, however, the Talmudic give and take is key. Without that, there would be no basis to the Tosafot. So who ended up completed the third stage? We find that according to Sephardic educational tradition, that not just any school child had the right to announce about himself, that he can indeed stand his own ground in all 6 orders of Shas. All the more so, they would not have been so audacious as to draw near to rule halakha from the Gemara without lending affinity to the celebrated halachic decisors. By their mouths we live. Meaning, if I look at the Gemara and I come to a different understanding as opposed to Harambam, but I don't know the halakha and I don't know the Miqra, I'm not yet ready to get into the Gemara. Who am I to go against the halakha that was established by those who achieved the third stage and gave us the halakha? There were few scholars who had indeed completed to satisfaction all the requirements of the third stage. Even they, placing their reverence above their wisdom, saw themselves as dwarves in comparison to the acknowledged decisors, and wouldn't rely on their own opinion unless they were firmly standing on the shoulders of giants, the knights of the nation of Israel. This is to say that unless you yourself were you've completed the third stage, you cannot go against someone else who completed the third stage, because that person received it from the chain of transmission. They received it from someone else who had completed the third stage. And so for me, say I'm at the second stage and I go forward and I decide to be posek halacha from the Gemara, I have skipped over someone who has essentially what a PhD in that. I have a master's. I can't be making the same argument as the person with the PhD because I haven't gone through that PhD curriculum and received it from other PhDs. Bad analogy, I think. Not the best analogy. All right, so now part 3. In the last 5 minutes, we'll try and do this. Again, I highly recommend for all of you to read this because 45 minutes is impossible to go through 12, I think maybe 13-page essay, and we can only get so far into it. Essentially, over here, this was the way things were done until the generation before the First World War. So we're looking at up until about 100 years ago, 115 years ago, that generation, this is the way it was. And these communities, I will say, Rabbi Dweck, he talks about this often, is that we need to think about what it means that all of the communities we come from, for the most part, are destroyed. They don't exist, which is very sad. They don't exist. They have been replaced or they have been destroyed. And so the community that my grandfather grew up in Eretz Yisrael, and the community that my father grew up in Shiraz, they're not the same anymore. It's completely changed. The community that my mother's family comes from in Halab does not exist anymore. There's no community in Halab anymore, in Aleppo. That has all moved to Brooklyn. And because of that move, things happened. There was not the same transmission. There was not the same focus on education, unfortunately. But as Rabbi Dweck points out, is that now that we've survived, what do? How do Sephardim respond to the terrible things that have happened? But now we're past, in a way, we're surviving. Our kids I'm in a very different place than my parents. I have a different economic outlook. I have a different life experience because I have not experienced displacement like they have. All right. So the 3 stages to learning Gemara, and this is, I think this is where we will end. We have a little bit to go through. 3 stages to learning Gemara. Shlosha, Midurim Hem, Girsa, Ayun, pesaq. We have the reading, the Girsa. Today, you can have different Girsaot of a Gemara. You have different readings in different manuscripts. Once you master Girsa, the reading of the text, then you can look at Ayun, which goes deeper. And then once you master Ayun, then you can make pesaq halacha. These 3 hubs are representative of the 3 aforementioned periods. The first hub encompasses teaching the wording of Gemara and its conclusions, ignoring the dialectical aspect. This means being able to simply recite it. Highly recommend for everybody to check out the Habura's Shiurim. They are members only, but maybe Sina can share them with you. Of Hakham Yosef Faur going through the Gemara, and he demonstrates for us what it means to read the Girsa properly. Once you understand how to read it properly, then you can go into Ayun. At the second hub, one descends to the depths of the Talmud's argumentation. You can start understanding what each part is saying. At the third is when you start looking at the different opinions that were stated in regards to the framework of the Talmudic treatment of the issue in light of the rest of the sages' literature. Okay, so we will look at I ended up getting rid of this quote just to move forward. So with Girsa, and please let me know if we need to end here or we should continue with the last 3 parts.
If you can do them in short, I think that makes sense.
Okay, so Girsa is the entire part is to this is known as Surata Dishma'atata. Okay, and again, Chacham Abe, he goes through this, he explains this much better than I am because I am not in the 3rd stage. I want to make that very well known. I am not in the 3rd stage. I have not gotten to this point. He talks about this though in his wonderful shiur. And this is essentially to say that you need to learn the structure. What is going on? What is the subject? What is the aim? What are the different stages of development? And once you figure out what is the point of the sugya, okay, we're not focused on any on details. we only focus on details to the extent that they touch on the understanding of the complete piece. Again, if you apply literature, the way that literature is taught in the university system or in the AP course system in high school, nobody is teaching Shakespeare with every single understanding. It would be impossible. You have to teach Shakespeare fully. And once you then understand the full story, now you can start breaking it down. You get who the different characters are. You get the plot. You get what the ending is all about. You have an idea. Once you have an idea, now we can go back and start dwelling on the details. And then we also have a number of works to, this is very important. A first-rate teacher would convey to students a thorough knowledge of these principles. There are many books that go into detail about these. Darchei Noam, Darchei Gemara, very, very popular. And now, so Iyun, once you understand the Girsa, now you study with Rashi and the Tosafot. The teacher brings to the student how to utilize Rashi and Tosafot, because each of those writings has different terms that you need to understand. Okay, after you understand those terms, now you can start understanding what they are saying. We'll continue just to finish off because we're running a little bit behind. Once you finish the Ayun, you are able to have pesaq. This means that you learn the Girsa, the Sugya, with all of the commentators. You start, the aim is twofold: knowing the literature of the sages and of the commentators through their interrelatedness. Among the many works which were available to teacher and student, and then he goes on to throughout many of the works by Hakhamim. You see there are quite a number of works. Again, I just want to point out that today, Dayan Ofer Livnat said, I was at a Habura meetup with him, and he was asked about learning today. And he said, we've never lived in a time where there was so much learning and such little knowledge. It really stuck with me that there are thousands of people today learning Daf Hayomi just to get through the page, front and back, nonetheless. And they don't take away a single halakha. They don't take away a single term, a specific term of the Talmud. I really wonder, what's the point of all of this learning if we're not walking away with any of the knowledge? And again, to get to the stage where you're learning Gemara and making pesaq, you have to do all of this. It's like overwhelming just to think about it. I'm not even 30 years old, and I think this would take my entire life to go through every single work, and I would only be able to read it maybe and barely understand it. That is a Chacham, to be able to go through all of this. So to finish, there were 3 levels to the learning. There was the Miqra, the Halakha, the Gemara. The main differences between Ashkenazi and Sepharadi approach to learning Gemara is the foundation necessary to approach the Gemara, meaning you had, in the Ashkenazi world, you went straight into it, whereas in the Sepharadi world, you had to first know the Miqra and the Halakha before you even got to it. And you needed a teacher that had a teacher that had a teacher that had a teacher that had a teacher all the way back to the Geonim. If you didn't have that, there's no talqim, there's no transmission. And the 3 steps of Gemara learning, ending with pesaq halakha, I'll reiterate, there was girsa, ayun, pesaq. Just to throw out a few questions for you to think about. Today, almost every single institution utilizes the Ashkenazi framework for learning. How could this approach that we looked at elucidated by Hakham Faur, how can we make a comeback in yeshivot? Is it possible? Is it worth it? Is it not worth it? Is it better to just start new yeshivot? That's a question to think about. What kind of, and this is on the organizational side, infrastructure side, what kind of impact would be made if children began learning Miqra alongside the Siddur in mass? What would the Beit Knesset look like if every child was taught the Pesukim, could go and read the Torah, could read the Nevi'im, could know the Pesukim that are brought in the Siddur alongside the Tefillot? And then how can this approach be applied in our community, in your community, amongst the adult population? Many of us who did not have this growing up. And with that, I thank you very much for this opportunity. Like I said, I myself am still learning. I am not in the 3rd stage. And God willing, I look forward to one day being able to finish the 1st stage fully and to finish the 2nd stage fully, and then maybe when I'm in my 40s, I can begin learning Gemara properly. I wish you all the best. And if you have any questions, please.
Thank you. First, thank you. And Sina, I don't know if you want to join as well. I'm going to, if anybody does want to open their cameras, I know that people have been camera shy, so it is what it is. But you're more than welcome to ask your questions. I did want to just put in my little anecdote is my kids always made fun of me when they were little, that they would come home and they'd have a parsha of the week thing from school, and they'd come to the table, and the first thing they would say is, "Oh, it's midrash. I can't say it right." Because the kid in second grade isn't supposed to be doing midrash; they're supposed to be saying, and so I like drilled it into my kid's head that first we learn pshat, first you learn the basics of what you're supposed to be learning, then you can learn all the commentary on it, and then you can learn everything else. You got to read it through at some point. So even in second grade, my kids knew you got to start with the basics. So, but they did not know that from school because school started with midrash. Kindergartners learn midrash.
Yeah, I think Rabbi Dweck talked about how at Barkai Yeshiva, they never taught the Miqra with the Rashi when he was the principal there. I don't know if that's still the case, but we need to ask ourselves, why are people growing up thinking that midrashim are from the Torah?
Yeah,
because people don't know. People need to be taught midrash properly. They're taught that it's children's stories. They don't understand that it's deep and you need to be taught how to read properly. I want to. You were talking about in Ashkenaz in the times of the Rashi. Remember, Rashi wrote a Perush on all the Tanakh. Studying Tanakh among the Bali Tosfot was very, very important. And just another thing to clarify. Also, it's important. It's not that it was illegal for a Jew to write in Latin. It just wouldn't happen because Latin was the language of the church. There was no neutral spaces to study, right? It would only be polemical. So they spoke French or German, but that didn't help you read the Latin books. Whereas if you lived in the Arabic world, speaking Arabic and reading Arabic is not a very big divide, and especially if you're scholarly and so then you get access to all this other stuff. It's a very, very big difference in that world, and it has to do with that neutral space for intellectual engagement that you had in the Islamic world, which was very special. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great tour. Maybe there's questions. I don't want to.
Nobody had questions today.
Questions?
Okay. You can type
There's
them
a lot
in
more to kind of absorb. Can I ask? Where do you see which yeshivot are applying this? Because my sense is that even Shas in Israel, for instance, did not follow in this way at all. It really adopted its pronunciation.
Shas wasn't started by Hakham Ovadia. People forget Shas was started by Rabbi Shach. It was not started by. It was started with Rabbi Shach. So we're talking about Rabbi Shach was biggest. But
so how do you understand? So where do you find this? Where is this?
I have a friend who studied in Hakhamim under Rav Mazuz for 2.5, almost 3 years. Again, we're talking about Bnei Brak also. I have most of my father's family lives in Bnei Brak. I've been there. It's a very, very intense place, right? And so even if you want to go to a place where they're learning Gemara Be'ayun, you have to still go to Bnei Brak. And that right there is not, you have to, that is a very different experience. It's not just here in New York City. From my understanding, there are a handful of teachers that have this approach. And so you have to find a Hacham. Again, I think that's what's very sad in our time is that there are just not a lot of Hakhamim that have gone through this approach that are left in the world. And I want to reiterate, I did not have this. I am playing catch up. I've been playing catch up since my mid-20s, and so I have two options. I can either fake it and say, well, whatever, I don't need to learn the Miqra, I don't need to learn the halacha, I just jump into the gemara. Or I can apply what my cousin, who's a rabbi in Israel, told me, and he said that he said to me many years ago when I was beginning to embark on this journey, he said, you need to always know your foundation. When you say a biracha, why are you doing that? Where is the halacha? When you do anything, ask yourself, is it a minhag? Is it a real minhag? Or is it like a minhag? Is it a halacha that we have from Harambam? How does Harambam talk about it? He gave a good example of like Sefirat HaOmer. Sefirat HaOmer, many people, they say today, if you miss one night, you can't say the bracha the next night. That's a machloket between Harambam and Shulchan Aruch. That's different. They have different pesaq on that. And he said, ask yourself, why are we even counting Sefirat HaOmer? What does that have to do with from the Torah? How does it talked about in the Mishnah? How is it talked about in the Halakha? Don't ask yourself what it's saying in the Gemara. First, understand the Halakha and the foundation where it comes from. And I will also finish by you. Look, you asked me a question, I answered something else. But there needs to be an awareness that this exists for us to at least try and make it a reality again. Mm-hmm. People don't even know this approach. And there are rabbis out there who have had talkim. There's not a lot of them. The Habura has probably half of them as teachers. Once we identify who those rabbis are, then we can start asking, well, how can we learn from them? And again, you can only learn from them once you have first graduated from Miqra and Halakha, right? And so everybody can begin at Miqra and Halakha, which means everybody in the Jewish world can start by knowing the Pesukim properly, reading them with ta'amim. What is the Targum on that Pasuk? And once I know that, okay, let me move on to the next book. Once I get through all of that, 929 is to learn all of Tanakh in 929 days. You can do it. It's not fun. It's not exciting all the time. You can do it also, right? And so I think that the biggest thing needs to be to re-emphasize the importance of Tanakh. And then after we master Tanakh alongside Siddur, think about how many people we know that can just get up and recite the entire Siddur. Very few people, and they're probably all the old school guys in the shul. And Hakham Yonatan Rahmani says also the old school women, like the grandmothers who know these things because they learned it also. So we need to find these people. And I would also push everybody, talk to your elders, ask your grandparents, how did they learn in the old country? They didn't learn the same way we learn today. And so that right there, that's my response to that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And I forgot to say also that Reconnector was also, look them up as well. They were also promoting the event today with Ashley Perry. So I want to make sure to mention them. Sorry. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, especially Yonatan, for very interesting and enlightening and thought-provoking discussions.
Mabruk. Thank you.
Thank you all. I wish you all the best.
You as well. Bye.